Me a ghost story that sounds completely unbelievable but is entirely true.
I've been trying to stitch this all day and it hasn't been working, so let's see if this works. I've had paranormal experiences since I was a preteen. This particular story I'm going to share is the most physical thing that's ever happened to me, and there was a witness, and I also have photographic evidence, but I don't think I can show it on TikTok because there's blood. My freshman year, when I was 18, I lived on campus with my best friend. We were roommates. My bed was against one wall and her bed was against the other wall, and they were raised beds, so there was storage underneath. It wasn't as high as a bunk bed, but it was still high enough. If we were standing, it was like at our chest. We had to hop up onto the bed. We also had a mini fridge, equally distanced between our two beds, that we kind of used as a bedside table. I had been going through a period of having sleep paralysis and nightmares. One particular night, I was lying on my right side and my back was to the wall, so I was facing the room. I was stirred awake to the sensation of my sheet, I just got the chills, slowly being moved. And the next thing I know, I wake up to the dead weight of my head slamming the mini fridge bedside table, and I fell on the floor. I immediately jumped in my roommate's bed screaming, "Help me, help me." Like my ear was ringing. She was like, "What happened?" I was like, "I don't know. I think I rolled out of bed." I did not roll out of bed. I'm now 26. I have never slept walk. I've never fallen out of bed ever except for this one time. The angle that I fell, my head hit the table right here. So I had a gash behind my ear that was bleeding. Because I was laying on my right side and landed on my right side, I think I was tugged out of bed. Because if I had rollen out of bed, I would have landed face down.
Ghost story that sounds completely unbelievable but is entirely true.
This hits so hard. Sometimes I feel like my whole life is a story that sounds completely unbelievable, but is also entirely true. However, I have a great one for this. I'm going to preface my ghost story by saying that I grew up in a cult called the Children of God. It's a fairly famous cult. Lots of people have done documentaries about it. It started in the 70s in California, and it was just awful. My parents were some of the leaders of this cult, which is truly a story for another time. However, because of that, I was born in the Philippines, I grew up in Japan and Europe and Africa, and I've seen some pretty wild things. However, there's one thing that stayed with me forever. And that is when I was about 13 years old, I think I just turned 13, my parents moved to a huge manor house in England. The cult had taken up residence. There was about 120 people living there, which can, kind of give you an idea of the scope of the place. It had a big pond/lake on the property, but it was huge. It was like a forest and just endless grounds, it seemed, especially to me as a child. There was also a caretaker who seemed ancient to me, but was probably only like 50 years old at the time that this all happened. And he had told us not to go to the pond lake thing, but I guess we ignored him, and I don't know if he ever really told us the reason. However, because of the madness that was my life and how I grew up, I had a lot of nightmares. In fact, real lucid nightmares, kind of lucid dreaming, where when I was a child, I could hardly distinguish reality from nightmare, to be honest. And by the time we got to this house, my nightmares were really bad. I would hear a woman screaming all the time in my dreams. I would sometimes see a woman in my dreams walking through the halls holding a candle. She would have wet hair and she would be screaming. Sometimes I was the woman screaming. Sometimes she was walking beside me. It was very terrifying. It would even happen to me when I was awake sometimes. And of course I told everybody, but no one believed me. The general consensus was that I had a demon and I needed desperate prayer, which was of course super helpful. Anyway, about 2 months after living in this place, my girlfriend and I were down in the basement getting wood because the whole house was heated by fireplaces. So we had to chop wood and we were bringing the wood up. And I think we were just hiding down there. I don't know. We had stayed a little longer than we should have. And as we were down there, it was a terrifying basement, lots of old paintings, and there was a 700-year-old staircase down there. It was just crazy stuff. Anyway, we're talking, and just out of the blue, out of nowhere, the basement just starts filling up with water, freezing cold water to about mid-calf. And we start to be able to see our breath. Also, I can hear that same screaming that's coming from my dreams. In fact, it was so vivid and clear that I thought, oh, I must be dreaming. That's why the basement is filling with water. Like, I'm lucid dreaming. That's what's happening. Like, this isn't real. But then I looked over at my girlfriend and she also heard the screams, which made us both start screaming, and we both just ran out of there and got out of there because it was so terrifying. Oh, also I could like taste the water in my mouth. It tasted like mold and bog water and like old biscuits. And I remember talking to her too, and she could taste it as well. Anyway, we ran and we got out of there, and it speaks to the horror of our lives that we just kind of forgot about that whole incident and carried on living to the best of our ability. Anyway, a couple months later, or maybe half a year later, we were all down by the pond lake thing that we weren't supposed to go by, and we were skipping rocks and stuff, and I remember looking into the water, and first there was nothing, and then I started to see a woman underneath the water, and she had her eyes closed. She was clearly deceased. Her face was quite swollen and white, waterlogged. She was folding her hands across her chest. And as I stared at her, she opened her eyes and looked directly at me. And of course, because it was terrifying, I opened my mouth to scream, and something grabbed the front of my shirt and actually pulled me into the water. And I was flailing, and the water was filling my mouth and nose, and it tasted, of course, like the basement water. And I'm not sure who I was with. I think I was there with some of my younger brothers. I have 9 brothers and sisters, so it could have been anyone. And my friend who was down in the basement with me, she was there as well. They grabbed me. They managed to pull me out of the water. I coughed and I spluttered. And, no one believed me. I told everyone what happened, and no one believed me except for my friend who was, had already experienced the random basement flooding. Anyway, I carried on living my life. We moved away from the house. We moved all over. And yeah. About 15 years later, I've escaped from the cult at this point. I'm living my own life, and I'm working with a different charity. And I somehow find myself back at this manor with this charity that's using this manor house for something completely different now. And the caretaker, who was on the grounds when I was a little girl, is still there. And he's like, oh, hi, I remember you. And I was like, oh, I remember you too. Like, I used to live here when I was a little girl. And he says, I know you were one of the haunted. And I thought, what? That wasn't a dream? Like, I guess I had put it in the dream drawer of my mind or something and just thought that was too crazy to be real. But he told me, actually, his grandfather and his grandfather's grandfather, and they had been caretakers on this property for hundreds of years. And in his grandfather's lifetime, the last royal woman who owned that manor, her husband had died in a war, and she received the missive informing her of his death at night, where after she read it, she had a psychotic break and ended up wandering through the house in her nightgown, screaming and crying and wailing until she finally went and unalived herself in the pond lake thing. And he told me, I've always thought about you over the years. My grandfather told me she chooses different women to haunt, and I saw that you were haunted, and I wonder if you're okay. And I thought, oh my God, this is like a movie. Like, this is the craziest thing ever. And I thought, I'm medium okay, but, oh, I can't believe you believe me. I said, no one's ever believed me. And he's like, oh, I believe you. That's it. That's my story.